5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another.
And that's why, as I stood there, I urged the Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, to send a new signal of openness to the world by tearing down that wall.
We'll be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of Inside Politics, the public affairs program that explores issues of local, state, national, and international concern. My name is Bob Beatty, my co-host is Mark Peterson, and we are coming to you from the friendly confines of Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. To be frank, Mark and I are very excited about today's show, which will look at questions surrounding voting, elections, and the electoral system in America. And we're very pleased to have as our guest Kansas Secretary of State, Ron Thornburgh. There is a Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times. Well, for anybody with even a passing interest in American politics and public affairs, the new millennium has brought interesting times and more. The 2000 presidential election, which wasn't decided until 36 days after Election Day, focused our attention on a number of issues that we want to look at in this half hour. And what better person to talk about them with than the man in charge of elections for the state of Kansas, Secretary Thornburgh. Secretary Thornburgh is a graduate of Washburn University and began working in the Secretary of State's office in 1983. He was elected to his first four-year term in 1994 and also currently serves as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And as Secretary of State, Mr. Thornburgh has concentrated on promoting voter turnout and encouraging voter participation. Mr. Thornburgh also made national news during the election 2000 period when he came out strongly against vote swapping, an issue among many others which we are eager to discuss with the Secretary. It's nice to have you here today.
It's good to be here. Thanks for letting me join you.
I wanted to start by asking about voter turnout. I believe nationally in the 2000 election, 51% was the figure that I have for voter turnout. In Kansas, was it 56%? Is that correct?
That's right. Taken as a percentage of the voting age population, right. Kansas traditionally will do between 5 and 10% better than the national average.
Do you consider this low, 56%? Seems like a relatively low figure, even though it's above the national figure.
Absolutely. Until we do much, much better than we're doing right now, we need to do some more things to encourage voter turnout. If you break those numbers down and what they mean by voting age population and by the time people get registered and by the time they actually show up to the polling place, we've got less than 20% of America making the decisions as to what actually happens, who our representatives are in our democracy. And until we turn that around, we're missing a huge voice in America. And I think we have to address that.
Why do you think it's so low? Not only in Kansas, but nationally, but...
I think the indicators are very clear as to why people don't participate in the elections. Generally, people don't vote because they think, A, my vote doesn't matter. One vote out of millions cast is a pebble in the stream. Secondly, they don't vote because they think all politicians are the same, that the political parties are the same, and I hate to say it, but that all politicians are liars, cheats, thieves, and crooks. And therefore, why should I participate and endorse someone along those lines? And until we can address those fundamental issues, that it does make a difference who you put in office, and it does make a difference what kind of individual and that you participate. I guarantee you that, and maybe I should be careful making any guarantees, but I believe that George Bush governs differently today than he would have with an overwhelming majority of the vote. He has to pay attention to both sides of the aisle. That makes a difference in his presidency. It makes a difference in the way Governor Graves has presided as governor, that he won with an overwhelming majority of the vote in the state of Kansas and with that support. So I think whether your candidate wins or loses, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's not the exact point of participating in a democracy.
Let me ask about the actual mechanics and registration. Minnesota has, and correct me if I'm wrong, same-day registration.
Correct.
Is that correct? And at these meetings, do you talk to the Minnesotans and say, well, is it working? Is there fraud? And maybe can we do it? Because I do have a number of students and other people say, well, I didn't get around to registering. Now I'm interested in the election, but I can't vote. So in effect, by some rules, people that may want to vote, of course, can't.
Yeah, and I will, let me qualify two things here very simply. Convenience is a very, very small part of why people don't vote. There are those, and I think with the student population, convenience is probably more of an issue than with any other population out there. But we don't see that as the top 10. It's not in the top 10 reasons as to why people don't vote, that I didn't have time to, or whatever the case may be. Minnesota does have same-day voter registration. North Dakota has no voter registration.
Okay.
You just show up at the polling place and you're allowed to cast a vote. Of course, in North Dakota, everybody literally knows everybody. But within Minnesota, they have an extensive computer system in which every polling place is hardline linked to a state voter registration database. And then if someone comes in to register that day, they check the system. If they're registered somewhere else, they transfer them to this polling place. And so it's all a, quite frankly, very expensive computerized system that they have in place that we've just simply not been able to implement in Kansas.
I wonder if I could interject and ask a question. You mentioned two things. You said, first of all, public perceptions about what politicians are, and secondly, this notion of votes not counting for much. If you had your druthers, how would you address that particular question? I mean, it is a mass society. Even in Kansas, we had something on the order of 2 million votes cast, as I recall, in the presidential election. I'm sorry, that's the state's population. Let me look at my figures for just a second. 1,070,000. Yeah. That's still a huge number. How do we get around that problem of the significance of a single voter's participation?
I think we have to address it long term. There's no quick fix Band-Aid we can put on that all of a sudden everybody's going to say, hallelujah, let's go vote. We have to address it with the current generations that are involved and with the upcoming generations. And I think that has to come through the education system. I think we need to work within the schools to teach why a democracy is important and why every voice in that democracy is important. I support an organization called Kids Voting Kansas. And in Kids Voting, we teach a curriculum in the schools about how to vote. And one of the reasons people don't vote is they don't know what's expected when they walk behind that magic curtain. And especially with that 18 to 24-year-old age group, not being embarrassed is very important. And you don't want to be embarrassed by closing that lever and having the curtain shut behind you and say, oh my gosh, what do I do now? And so Kids Voting actually teaches how to cast a vote and how the process works. But the parents get involved because the students go to the polling place with their parents. The community gets involved because they staff the polling place. And all of this comes together to teach young people that your vote is important, a single vote is important, it's important to us, we hope it'll be important to you as well.
But do you think we really give that message in the United States? First of all, I've been to a few countries, and America's the only one I've experienced where we vote on a weekday. And also, I remember in this last election, there was a big issue because the polls were being closed and people were lined up to vote. It was a big deal, oh, should we keep them open? And you think, well, yes, let people vote. I mean, it seems there's a message of there's barriers to voting here. Why isn't Election Day a holiday? I mean, would you support it being a holiday? I mean, this is a democracy. It should be one of the most important days of the year. Why not give everyone the day off and say, go vote today, it's Election Day?
I think you hit it right on the head when you said this is America. simply because of the way Americans look at their electoral system and the history of our electoral system. I believe that without some fundamental philosophical changes in the American people, that if we made Election Day a holiday, it would simply become a 4-day ski weekend. And we would all be in Colorado or in the New York mountains skiing, as opposed to taking the day off and celebrating our democracy.
Make it on a Wednesday.
and so there might be some ways to get around that, but the economics of that become very difficult with the business community to create another holiday where things are closed, or another shopping day, as some people would look at it. And so I would support re-emphasizing Election Day. I'm not sure I'm ready to declare a holiday for that just yet.
Of course, one of the original ideas when reforms were talked about after the election was making it along with Veterans Day,
right,
at least every 4 years, I believe, and I don't know how far that one.
I think that just becomes more confusing. Election Day needs to be somewhat consistent, and if you make it this day every 4 years and another day in the odd-numbered years, and pretty soon we don't know. I mean, we all know when tax day is, April 15th every year. There's no confusion about that, and I think we need to do the same thing with the elections.
What about Oregon's idea of the vote by mail? I believe they claim that it's increased turnout by a few points. They've claimed. Have you talked to them about, Oregonians, about that? Have you thought about it for Kansas?
Kansas was actually one of the first states in the union to create vote by mail. Now, we have it limited to special elections rather than candidate-driven elections. But in those special elections where we will traditionally get 10 to 15% voter turnout in a polling place system, with vote by mail, we get between 75 and 80% voter turnout in those same elections. So we're having an enormous impact within those. Unfortunately, those who design the system, those who vote to implement the system, the candidates or the members of the legislature, are not willing to turn their own election over to the U.S. mail.
What's the argument against that? I mean, the Oregonians seem fairly happy, I think.
Yes, and I think they are. The Oregon Secretary of State continues to promote it, and it works very well within Oregon. There are those who are concerned about the fraud aspect. I have to admit I am not among those. It is simply an expanded absentee ballot. We have no history of that within the state of Kansas, and we monitor it very closely. Quite frankly, it boils down to, and some of my friends in politics will be angry about this, but it's tougher to campaign. When everybody is casting votes during a 2-week period, it's tough to have that campaign peak for 2 full weeks, and you don't know how to design your ad campaigns, you don't know how to design all the mailers to get in there, and it's much more difficult on those who are trying to win the votes. And unfortunately, that's not a good reason not to do it.
And before Mark wanted to get on another topic, but Oregon also publishes, in conjunction with the vote by mail, a very thick voter's guide. Have you thought about that, or is it just a matter of money? Or because it would seem to be very useful for Kansans to get that in the mail and be able to, a few days before the election, really go over the issues and the candidates.
Yeah, there are a number of states that do voters' guides, and it's a handful. I can't tell you which ones they are necessarily. I know the state of California literally sends a phone book.
Yeah.
It is 3 or 4 inches thick, depending on the part of the country or the part of the state. We have looked at doing something like that in Kansas in conjunction with a couple of different organizations, and what we found is that there are probably, at last count, a dozen different voters' guides being made available. What we're finding is that different special interest organizations all do their surveys of the legislative candidates or the statewide candidates, and then they ship their voters' guide out to their constituency. I would guess that there's probably not a Kansan who does not get some kind of voters' guide of one sort or another right now, even though it's not published by the state of Kansas. We looked into doing that, and it would be a little over $1 million in which to get that into every registered voter's household, and that's an expenditure that the legislature has not chosen to make right now.
Okay, we'll talk to the legislature about that. Mark, you wanted to move on?
Yeah, you gathered a bit of national attention during the election when you reacted to some allegations that over the internet people were trading Gore votes for Nader votes. Vote swapping has a sort of a long and time-honored tradition in legislative venues. Tell us a little bit, reprise your position on that for us. What was your concern?
It was very simple. There were folks within the state of Kansas, and I'm going to use California as the example, and they said, look, if you folks in California will vote for Gore to make sure that we give all of the Gore delegates to the Electoral College, then we'll do that. And we here in Kansas promise we'll vote for Nader. And so the bottom line is Nader's Green Party would get their percentage to become a recognized political party in the federal matching funds. Gore would get the electoral votes. And it struck me as just basic bribery. And honestly, I've been told by the Kansas Attorney General and my own counsel in the Secretary of State's office, they said, Ron, you can't do this. And I felt very strongly about it, and that I thought any time that I change my vote in exchange for another benefit, a benefit of someone maintaining votes in the Electoral College or someone receiving federal funds, that's bribery. And I called it that, and I called it that very vocally. And everyone told me I was wrong, and maybe by the court of law I am, but I still stand by what I said.
Fair enough. But the issue of getting Gore electoral votes and getting the Greens status as a legitimate party for the federal election funding sort of speaks to one of the critical issues that we encounter with our students. They always look like the RCA Victor dog when you start talking about the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. We have this institution that at some levels is kind of tough to understand, and I'm wondering what your views on the subject of Electoral College reform and presidential elections might be.
I think the Electoral College is an antiquated system that was barely of value when it was instituted and is of no value today, especially in today's with the technology and the mass marketing and the media and everything else that goes along to drive presidential elections. The Electoral College serves very little value in the United States of America. It was put there as a backstop in case the American public, quote, made a mistake. Then the wise elders of the Electoral College could step in and correct that mistake. There's obviously not a need for that. Now, having said that, and I know I sound like a politician here. I feel strongly both ways. But having said that, the Electoral College actually benefits small states like Kansas. Mm-hmm. Our 6 electoral votes give us more power as a percentage of the Electoral College than our population gives us as a percentage of the United States population. So what I would like to see us do is see the country as a whole, if we're going to retain the Electoral College, and I see no movement whatsoever to do away with it. If we're going to retain the Electoral College, I'd like to see us go to a congressional breakdown where every congressional district gets 1 vote. The winner of the majority of votes within the states gets the 2 bonus delegates to the Electoral College that represent our United States senators. That way you're going to get a truer reflection rather than the winner-take-all system that's in 48 of the 50 states right now. This is a system that Maine and Nebraska use very well. I think I'd like to see the state of Kansas move that way if the rest of the nation moves that way. Simply because if we start dividing up on a congressional basis, we just dilute the power of our vote right now. And let's face it, we don't get much attention in the presidential election already. And if we dilute that even further, I think it becomes problematic for us. And that goes back to, I had a number of people state that my vote for president was lost. If I were to vote for anyone other than George W. Bush in the state of Kansas, my vote was lost. And I go back to what I said. I believe that George W. Bush, President Bush, governs differently today because he lost the popular vote to Al Gore than he would have otherwise. So those votes in the state of Kansas made a difference. Even though they didn't apply to the Electoral College, they're making a huge difference in the governance of our country.
Now, certainly the constitutional impediment to changing the Electoral College is pretty substantial, but the states, the Constitution gives the states the responsibility for allocating electors. So going to a proportional system, whether it's pure proportionality, rounding to the nearest whole elector, or the system you described where we allocate on the basis of congressional districts, could be done on a state-by-state basis. You made reference to the fact that everybody ought to do this, otherwise you stand to lose if you become a front runner and others choose not to. How do you think, one, do you see a prospect for that sort of a movement actually taking place? And doesn't somebody have to bite the bullet and go first, or do you really think that collectively the states can negotiate this sort of a proportional system?
You're right in that the states have the authority to do so. And I will say that I see virtually no movement in that direction whatsoever. In my involvement with the National Association of Secretaries of State, we've been working on a presidential primary system and trying to develop a better nominating system as opposed to the tail end of the Electoral College system. But I've not seen much movement in this direction. And to be very frank about it, the reason I don't think we see any movement along this direction is that the two major political parties in the United States of America understand the rules of the game as it's played right now. We understand where the electoral votes are. We understand how to win electoral votes as they stand right now. If you go and change the rules of the game on us, we don't know how to win. That's the bottom line. If you don't win, you don't get to set the rules.
That's right.
We'll be right back after this short break with more from Kansas Secretary of State Ron Thornburgh.
It is more than a trial by fire. It is a rite of passage, a challenge to join the elite. And if you succeed, if you can master your fear, outsmart your enemy, and never yield even to yourself, you will be changed forever. The few, the proud, the Marines.
Welcome back to Inside Politics, where Mark Peterson and I are talking to Kansas Secretary of State Ron Thornburgh. Mark, you had a couple of comments about the Electoral College you wanted to...
Now, some of the earlier discussion reminded me that you and I got into a fairly heated argument around the time of the Florida controversy about the Electoral College, and I think if I remember your position correctly, you sort of share Secretary Thornburgh's position that it's an anachronism whose time is long past. So in preparing for today's discussion, I did a little noodling and doodling to come up with a couple of scenarios to suggest to you that the problems that are associated with doing away with the anachronism. I took a shot at it from 2 points. One, lots of people who were criticizing during the election wanted to just simply do away with the Electoral College. It's in the Constitution, a little tough to do, but there is an aspect that might appeal, and that is that the Electoral College has this essentially 100-point bonus that comes from every state getting 2 electoral votes for their senatorial representation. So I ran one model, and I took away the 100 so that we just have 438, the number of members of the House of Representatives plus the 3 seats for the District of Columbia. In that scenario, we would have had a much different outcome. In that scenario, Al Gore gets 226 electoral votes, and George Bush got 211, which sort of proves the point of the electoral map that shows that broad band of Midwestern and Western states solidly in the Republican camp. The second model that I took a look at was doing it on pure proportionality, not quite the model that Secretary Thornburgh suggested, but one in which every state's electoral vote is allocated proportionally along the popular vote, rounding to the nearest whole elector. In that situation, we actually wind up with a much tighter outcome. It still comes out in Al Gore's favor, 262 votes to 260. But there are 16 electoral votes in that model that if the alternate parties that ran, the third parties that ran, had been one party, would have picked up those electoral votes. The curious thing about that is that neither one of those work.
So it would have gone to the House?
It would have gone to the House, exactly so. In the first, of course, it would have been a question of constitutional ratification, not likely to happen. But in the second, the Constitution, Article 12, says it has to be an absolute majority of electors.
So in the second one, it would have gone to the House, and the House, with a Republican majority, would have voted for George W. Bush, and the Senate, with a Gore being the tiebreaker, could have voted for Joseph Lieberman as vice president.
And then we'd have had the Jefferson-Adams administration reprise.
Sounds great.
Great's not quite the word I was looking for. You know, one of the things I will throw out, and I know I'm contradicting myself here, but if we had done away with the Electoral College prior to the last election, the chaos is the only word I can think of for what was happening in Florida would have been happening all over the country. We would have had recounts everywhere in the country, and I'm not sure that would have been good for democracy at that point. I've said before that democracy is not the equivalent of expediency. Our job is not necessarily to count quickly, but it needs to be done in an orderly fashion so as to bring it in for a landing and make sure we get it done.
That's a good point. We probably couldn't get rid of the Electoral College until we could guarantee basically that all 50 states could go through a recount.
That the process has to be in place to allow that to happen. You're right.
But I would add that I think the saving grace of the 2000 election, confused as it is, goes right directly to a point that the Secretary made earlier. If there's an American adult alive who thinks that their vote doesn't count anymore, a 470,000 popular vote margin and the narrowness of many of these state decisions certainly puts the lie to the notion that my vote isn't going to count for anything.
Right. Let me go back to the idea that it'd be difficult for one state to switch how the electoral votes are allocated because no other states would do it, and we'd be an outlier. And I wonder if Kansas would go do something like a proportional system. And so if 40% the votes were Democratic, there would be a few electoral votes for the Democratic candidate. Would that bring maybe an Al Gore, a Democratic candidate, to say, well, let's stop in Wichita. You know, what the heck? If we can get 4 more % of the votes, we're going to get 3 out of Kansas. And maybe then that would prompt a Republican candidate, ooh, I'm going to go make sure they don't get that 4, and actually bring candidates here, which, of course, we know they don't come to Kansas.
It's tough to think about what might be, but what I can tell you is I'm not sure the presidential candidates are populating Nebraska right now, and I don't believe they're populating Maine, which are the only 2 states that provide for the proportional voting. And so I don't know that would be the case.
Okay.
And much of the problem, of course, there is that presidential campaigning is so focused on major media markets rather than on the direct calculation of electoral votes. And of course, if we went to a popular vote system, then that concentration on media markets would be amplified. So it's kind of like you got to dance with the girl you brung.
Well, maybe I don't want to dance. Okay, we have 20 seconds. Is there anything, the one thing you'd like to see reformed in the elections process, or the main points of the bill you've been talking about nationally?
I think we have to understand that true election reform in America involves 3 things: people, process, and technology. Of those 3 elements, technology is the least important. We need to address the education of the people who administer elections as well as those who participate. We need to make sure the election process is accurate and orderly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for letting me join you today.
And Mark, thanks for being here.
Well, always happy to be here, Bob.
That's all the time we have for today. And again, I'd like to thank Kansas Secretary of State Ron Thornburgh for taking the time to come by and discuss all of these issues. And for Mark Peterson and everybody else here at Inside Politics, we thank you for watching. It's time for us to go.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.